Good day, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this conference to talk about the future of sustainable aviation. It's a pleasure to be here. I know Dubai is a big center for aviation globally and can take a leadership role also on this topic. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about sustainable aviation fuels and where we see the future heading and what the possibilities are. I am speaking as a Vice President of Neste, one of the leaders in the renewable aviation and renewable fuel space globally. We were founded after the war, based in Northern Europe out of Finland, but in the recent years, in the last 20 or so years, have transformed the company to become the #1 leader in the provision and production of renewable fuels made from waste and residues globally. We are now ranked in the world top 100 in sustainability index, and for several years have been in the top 3, reflecting our commitment, our purpose, our vision, and also the investments we've been making in renewable fuels and production. Last year, our products enabled our customers to reduce their CO2 emissions by some 9.6–10 million tons, a significant contribution as part of the larger journey that we as society are embarking upon. We certainly invest a considerable amount of our resources on R&D. So we're not satisfied with already being a leader. We recognize fully that there's more research required to further develop new technologies, become more efficient, and unlock other feedstocks to grow production going forward. And on the topic of growing production, you can see here we also have plans to further grow our current production of some 3 million tons to 4.5 million tons of renewable fuels by 2023. So we're both investing in the production capacity and also in R&D. So why is sustainable aviation fuel so important to us? Well, this chart is probably familiar to many of you, but I thought it was important just to put this conference and this discussion in context. So on the right-hand side, in fact, we're part of a broader societal shift to carbon neutrality, zero carbon emissions. Many countries now have committed to zero carbon emissions by 2050. Including many countries within the EU and in Europe. Some countries have actually committed to achieving carbon neutrality before 2050. And indeed, recently, we've obviously seen further announcements from China and indeed Japan just a week or two ago, committing to zero carbon emissions by 2050 or shortly thereafter. And there's a lot of work going on within the aviation industry with ICAO, and indeed within the airline, with each of the airlines and some of the airline partnerships like One World, to commit to at the very least 50% reduction in carbon emissions, and as I say, some airlines are already committing to more than that. And as we know, the carbon emissions can be reduced through a number of mechanisms: new aircraft, more efficient operations, and of course, sustainable aviation fuel, which is the focus of this conversation. I think it's worth noting also that there's an increasing, I'd say, factual underpinning to the proposals that are being made around growing sustainable aviation fuel. Only in the last week or two, ATAG has issued their report demonstrating that they see aviation needing 200 to 300 million tons worth of sustainable aviation fuel by 2050. And in parallel, there was a recent report by the Clean Skies for Tomorrow Coalition, working with the World Economic Forum and McKinsey, talking about how, from a feedstock point of view, that level of supply is certainly achievable for SAF. And it's worth, I would hasten to add, that report was from a coalition that combined producers, suppliers, airlines, and airports. So the full spectrum of players in the aviation industry. But now a little more about SAF, and I want to talk about the availability, the sustainability, the affordability, and how policy can help address some of those affordability issues. So ASAP, if you so will. So with respect to the availability and the sustainability, what I would say here is that sustainable aviation fuel is now available. It's made from wastes and residues. It's effectively comparable with fossil jet fuel, so is a drop-in fuel that can be immediately supplied and used through the existing airport infrastructure, and obviously in the existing aircraft. As I'm sure many of you know, a number of different methods of production have been approved for use as jet fuel, but made from sustainable or renewable feedstocks. It also has the advantage of burning actually more cleanly than fossil jet fuel, with fewer particulate emissions, which may, I think, science will confirm this in due course, but may well have additional benefits in terms of reducing the climate warming effects of contrails. It's commercially available and in use today, and is delivering carbon emission reductions when looked at end to end from the through the life cycle, from production and use of recycled wastes through to when it is used in an aircraft. It's generating up to an 80% reduction in carbon emissions versus the fossil fuel alternative. So it can make a significant contribution to the reduction of carbon in the aviation industry when looked at on an end-to-end basis. And in terms of availability, this chart shows where it's being supplied by Neste, but indeed there are other suppliers, and so in fact other locations are also being supplied with SAF nowadays. But as I'm sure you're all aware, it's focused in Europe, Northern Europe, and in the United States or North America, in particular on the West Coast. So we have, as an industry, been supplying SAF into Norway and Sweden now for some years. More recently, in the last year, into the Netherlands, Germany, and also quite recently into the UK and France. In the North America, the supply is focused on the West Coast, not only at San Francisco, but also competitor suppliers are supplying into other locations on the West Coast. And indeed, just a couple of weeks ago, we announced supply into Japan. So that's the first supply of SAF into Japan. So what's also worth noting here is that we as Neste are opening our shop. We're very, very keen to ensure that the market can grow as quickly as possible. And so are supplying not only directly to commercial airlines and into the general or business aviation space, but also to distributors such as ABP and Shell Aviation, to enable the SAF to get to market in as many places as possible. And we as Neste are also investing in the supply chains ourselves to ensure that we can supply at the airport. So in particular, the major hub airports like Amsterdam, Stockholm, Oslo, Frankfurt, Paris. These are the places, and indeed London. These are the places where we need to be making sure that SAF is available alongside more airports in North America. And indeed, we could argue, and we should discuss that. Can we make SAF available indeed also in the Middle East, in the UAE? It is possible to deliver it, as we've demonstrated with the supply into Japan. But what I would say is that the countries that where we are supplying SAF is where there is a positive, constructive regulatory support framework, and I think that is going to be key to helping address the issue of price and affordability especially in the near future. And so this chart shows the kinds of mechanisms that policy is introducing, in particular in Europe and North America, to help incentivize the use of SAF. So there are two fundamental dimensions to this. One is incentivizing the demand side, and the other is helping provide support, financial support for less well-developed technologies to grow the supply going forward. So this chart focuses in particular on the demand side and shows there are two key ways by which we can promote and help bridge the price gap to fossil jet fuel. The first is by providing incentives to help close the gap, and the second is by requiring a certain proportion of all the aviation fuel supplied in that market to be SAF, a so-called blending mandate or supply mandate. The markets where incentives have already been introduced were mentioned actually in the earlier panel session. Markets like the Netherlands, the UK, and in the United States, in particular on the West Coast, the incentives can amount to $1,000 a ton or more. So in effect, significantly closing the price gap between fossil jet fuel and sustainable aviation fuel. And so these are markets which I would anticipate, and would regard as great opportunities for airlines to potentially consider in terms of employing SAF. There are other markets in Europe which are talking about introducing incentives as part of the so-called Renewable Energy Directive, which has been decided upon in the EU, and so there'll be further incentives in other EU countries coming into play from 2022. But the Netherlands, the UK, the US already have these incentives in play today. Blending mandates on the other side of the coin have been introduced in Norway and have been announced to be introduced in 2021 in Sweden, and also could potentially be deployed elsewhere in the EU. Discussions and consultations are currently underway. So whilst mandates may feel like they're less preferable, they are applicable to everybody, and so it would ensure a level playing field. And if, of course, they're applied across a number of markets in Europe, in the EU, across the EU, then indeed it would mean that all airlines would be subject to the same requirement. Incentives, on the other hand, as is obvious from the name, will help reduce the price and hopefully therefore be more attractive to airlines and indeed end customers. And I think that's one of the key points I would make here in terms of affordability. Policy is important, but also the end customer is an important player in all of this. And be they corporates or private individuals, certain airlines now have introduced programs to enable their end customers to specifically specify the purchase of SAF for their flights. And this is another way by which the price gap to fossil jet fuel can be overcome. Maybe before I talk a little bit more about the future roadmap, a few words about the availability. So we as Neste are currently producing 100,000 tons of SAF in Europe. And as I say, that is being made available both directly by Neste as well as also through distributors at various locations in Europe and North America. But that we have concrete investment plans already underway with the known technology, which we know can be scaled up, with a view to adding an additional 1.5 million tons worth of production capacity by early 2023, in particular as a result of an investment in Singapore, which is underway right now, and also then additional investments which we are reviewing with a view to making a final decision on in early 2021 in Rotterdam. And I would hasten to add, we're not the only company that is investing in renewable fuels and renewable jet fuel capacity. There are other companies that are looking at converting fossil fuel refineries and investing in new plants as well. So there's a clear momentum now to this existing proven production technology to scale up in Europe and indeed also in North America. And then over and above that, you've got new technologies which will open up additional capacity and additional feedstocks to grow the production through to 2030 and beyond. So maybe I've talked a little bit now about availability, about sustainability. I've talked about affordability and how policy, but also end customer programs can help bridge the price gap. Now, to build on what Alejandro talked about a little bit earlier in the panel discussion, to just give our view as to the outlook and roadmap for SAF going forward. So right now, all of the production and the production that I've talked about that is coming to market over the next 2 or 3 years is this so-called HEFA-based production method using hydrotreated esters and fatty acids. This is based from wastes and residues and can also be expanded to other waste from agriculture and forestry. This, we believe, can unlock a supply of up to 10% of total global aviation fuel demand. But thereafter, there are other technologies based off using different various feedstocks, waste feedstocks, using either the so-called Fischer-Tropsch gasification technology, or alternatively the so-called alcohol-to-jet technology based off ethanol. Those will, with the broader feedstock pools they can tap into, enable actually the entire global aviation fuel demand to be met using these various wastes and residues from around the world. The real opportunity that a lot of people are now talking about that goes beyond that is the so-called power to liquids technology, where we still produce a liquid hydrocarbon, but it is from the extraction of hydrogen from water and carbon either from industrial emissions or from direct air capture. This is highly power intensive, and this is why renewable power generation, low cost renewable power generation, is absolutely key to unlocking this form of production of liquid hydrocarbons. But it is something that certainly the Middle East and the UAE could be well suited to, given your potential around, in particular, solar power. So what I'm trying to paint here is a picture that the existing technologies can be scaled to 10% or more of global demand, but there are then complementary additional production pathways that can be unlocked for the future. So let's not wait for the future. We already have solutions today that are available that can be scaled up. And this chart shows the relative production costs that we see for these different technologies, and shows it over time. This is a chart out of the report I referred to earlier, that was the work that was done by McKinsey with the Clean Skies for Tomorrow coalition of the World Economic Forum, and shows how the so-called HEFA current production method for producing SAF is the lowest cost. It is clearly more expensive than fossil jet fuel, but as I've indicated, there are ways and means by which we can help close some of that price gap. The other technologies are less technically developed and certainly not commercially scaled yet, and will take time, but over time, 2030, 2040, and by 2050, we see those certainly being competitive from a cost point of view with the so-called HEFA-based SAF production method. There are a number of factors that influence the production cost. The capital cost on some of these future technologies is very significant, whereas in the current method of production, the raw material feedstock costs are probably the bigger driver. So you need to understand how you can drive down these different cost drivers to become more competitive with fossil jet fuel. And of course, what this representation doesn't show, and what Alejandro discussed in the prior panel, is how obviously you need to take into account also the externality cost or effect cost of the carbon that's being emitted, which is not built into this price comparison, but which may over time become more and more of a factor also to be borne in mind. So I've talked now about the availability and the sustainability. I've talked about how policy can help bridge some of the price challenges with fossil jet fuel, alongside how end customer programs could positively influence that, and also a little bit about the roadmap going forward. So in summary, SAF is available and sustainable. It's available in Europe and North America today, and could indeed be even supplied into the UAE. But there are policy mechanisms that are in place and are developing quickly that will both help bridge the price gap, alongside also customer programs which could well help bridge the price gap. And looking forward, there are multiple technology options for future production, which definitely vary in terms of their attractiveness over time and by region. But what's absolutely clear is that we as an industry need to work collaboratively and in partnerships to push forward with these future technologies, whilst taking advantage of the production methods we've got in place today. And the industry is investing. Neste is investing, and others are investing, and are ready to supply the SAF today. And as I said, there are ways by which some of the incremental cost can be mitigated. So that concludes this presentation on sustainable aviation fuel from a Neste perspective. If you do have any other questions, please do contact me directly or through our virtual booth. Thank you very much, and look forward to the rest of the day.